Apollo and Daphne. One day, Cupid, the little god of love, sat on the bank of a river playing with his arrows. The arrows were very tiny. Some had points of gold, and others had points of lead. None of them looked as if they could do much harm. That day, Apollo, the great sun god, walked along the bank of the same river when returning from his fight with the serpent of darkness called the Python. He had just used a great number of his wonderful golden arrows in killing this gigantic serpent. Feeling very proud of his victory over the Python, he said, when he saw Cupid at his play, "Ho, what are such little arrows as these good for?" Cupid's feelings were very much hurt at this. He said nothing, but he took his little arrows and flew to the top of Mount Parnassus. There he sat down on the grass and took a leaden point arrow from his quiver. Looking all about him for some mark for his arrow, he saw Daphne walking through a grove. Daphne was the daughter of Peneus, the river god. She was so beautiful that the sleeping flowers lifted their heads and burst into full bloom at her coming. Cupid shot the leaden point arrow straight at Daphne's heart. Although it did her no other harm, this little blunt arrow made Daphne feel afraid, and without knowing what she was running from, she began to run. Then Cupid, who was very naughty, took a golden pointed arrow from his quiver, and with this wounded Apollo. The golden pointed arrow had the power to make Apollo love the first thing he saw. This chanced to be Daphne, the river nymph, who came running by just then, with her golden hair floating out behind her. Apollo called to Daphne that there was nothing to fear. Then, as she would not stop running, he ran after her. The faster Apollo followed, the faster Daphne ran, and she grew more and more afraid all the time, for the little leaden pointed arrow was sticking in her heart. She ran till she came to the bank of her father's river, and by this time she was so tired that she could run no farther. She called on her father for help. The river god heard, and before Apollo could overtake her, changed her into a tree, a beautiful tree with glossy evergreen leaves and blossoms as pink as Daphne's own cheeks. When Apollo came up with Daphne, there she stood on the bank of the river, not a nymph any longer, but a beautiful tree. Apollo was heartbroken at first to see how he had lost Daphne. It was all the fault of the little golden pointed arrow. Since this tree was all that was left of Daphne, Apollo loved the tree and said that it should be planted by the side of his temple. He made himself a crown from his evergreen leaves, which he always wore for Daphne's sake. This tree still grows in Greece and is called the laurel of Apollo. How Apollo got his lyre. Mercury was the child of Maia, the eldest of the Pleiades, and lived with his mother in a cave among the mountains. One day, when he was only just big enough to walk, he ran out of doors to play in the sunshine and saw a spotted tortoise shell lying in the grass. He laughed with pleasure at sight of the pretty thing and quickly carried it into the cave. Then he bored holes in the edge of the shell, fastened hollow reeds inside, and with a piece of leather and strings made a lyre of it. This was the first lyre that was ever made, and most wonderful music lay hidden in it. That night, when his mother was asleep, Mercury crept slyly out of his cradle and went out into the moonlight. He He ran to the pastures where Apollo's white cattle were sleeping and stole 50 of the finest heifers. Then he threw his baby shoes into the ocean and bound great limbs of tamarisk to his feet so that no one would be able to tell who had been walking in the soft sand. After this, he drove the cattle hither and thither in great glee for a while, and then took them down the mountain and shut them into a cave. But one would think from the tracks left in the sand that the cattle had been driven up instead of down the mountain. A peasant who was hoeing in his vineyard by the light of the full moon saw this wonderful baby pass by, driving the cattle, and could hardly believe his own eyes. No one else saw Mercury, and just at sunrise, the little mischief went home to his mother's cave, slipped in through the keyhole, and in a twinkling was in his cradle with his tortoise-shell lyre held tightly in his arms, looking as if he had been sleeping there all night. Apollo soon missed his cattle. It happened that the man who had been hoeing his grapevines by moonlight was still working in the same field. When Apollo asked him whether he had seen anyone driving cattle over the road, the man described the baby that he had seen with the curious shoes and told him how it had driven the cattle backward and forward and up and down. By daylight, the road looked as if the wind had been playing havoc with the young evergreens. Their twigs were scattered here and there, and great branches seemed to have broken off and blown about in the sand. There were no tracks of any living thing except the tracks of the cattle, which led in all directions. This was very confusing, but Apollo, knowing that no baby except his own baby brother could drive cattle, went straight to Maia's cave. There lay Mercury in his cradle, fast asleep. When Apollo accused him of stealing his white cattle, he sat up and rubbed his eyes and said innocently that he did not know what cattle were. He had just heard the word for the first time. But Apollo was angry and insisted that the baby should go with him to Jupiter to have the dispute settled. When the two brothers came before Jupiter's throne, Mercury kept on saying that he had never seen any cattle and did not know what they were. But as he said so, he gave Jupiter such a roguish wink that he had made the god laugh heartily. Then he suddenly caught up his lyre and began to play. The music was so beautiful that all the gods in Olympus held their breath to listen. Even Jupiter's fierce eagle nodded his head to the measures. When Mercury stopped playing, Apollo declared that such music was well worth the 50 cattle, and agreed to say no more about the theft. This so pleased Mercury that he gave Apollo the lyre. Then Apollo, in return for the gift of the wonderful lyre, gave Mercury a golden wand called the caduceus, which had power over sleep and dreams and wealth and happiness. At a later time, 2 wings fluttered from the top of this wand, and 2 golden snakes were twined around it. Besides presenting Mercury with the caduceus, Apollo made him herdsman of the wonderful white cattle. Mercury now drove the 50 heifers back to their pastures. So the quarrel was made up, and the 2 brothers, Apollo and Mercury, became the best of friends. On a day when the wind is blowing and driving fleecy white clouds before it, perhaps if you look up, you will see the white cattle of Apollo, but you will have to look very sharp to see the herdsman, Mercury. Mercury and Argus. Argus was a watchman with 100 eyes set in a circle all around his head. When he slept, he closed only 2 eyes at a time. The other 98 were always wide open, so it could not have been easy to steal away anything that Argus was watching. Now it happened that Juno, the wife of Jupiter, was very jealous of a beautiful river nymph called Io. Jupiter, in order to save Io from the jealous anger of Juno, changed her into a white heifer. Juno, suspecting that the white heifer was really Io, set Argus with his 100 eyes to watch her. Poor Io was very unhappy. Her father, the river god, did not know her, neither did her sister nymphs, but they used to pat the white heifer and feed it grass from their hands. At last, Io wrote her name with her hoof in the sands of the riverbank, and then her father and sisters knew that the pretty white heifer was their own Io. She had no sooner revealed herself to her family in this way than Argus drove her away to a field that lay far back from the river, where the river god and the nymphs could not come, and then set himself down on the top of a high hill, meaning to watch her more closely than ever. Jupiter felt sorry for Io, still did not dare change her back into her natural form while Argus was watching her. But remembering how Mercury, when he was less than a day old, had stolen away the cattle of Apollo, he now set this prince of thieves, this mischievous, loving Mercury, to steal Io away from Argus. Mercury thought there could be no better fun. He laid aside his winged cap and his winged shoes and dressed like the shepherds in that country. He carried his golden wand, the caduceus, in his hand, and as he walked along, played carelessly on a shepherd's pipe. Then, finding a few goats feeding at the side of the road, he drove them slowly before him. Argus found his watch rather tiresome and was glad enough to talk to anyone who happened to pass by. He was very glad when he saw Mercury coming with the goats, and he invited the pretended shepherd to come and sit by him under the trees in the shade and play on his pipe and tell stories. Mercury sat down on a stone by the side of Argus and began to play, very softly, so softly that the music was like the sighing of the wind through the branches of the trees. The day was warm, and there was no other sound except the shrill singing of the cicadas. 2 of Argus's eyes soon closed. The others might have remained open if there had not been a drowsy magic in Mercury's piping. The soft notes came soothingly, slower and slower, and one after another, Argus's other eyes began to close, till only 2 remained open. These 2 eyes were very bright, they fairly twinkled, and they kept their watch on Io through all Mercury's playing. Then Mercury began to tell stories, and at last the 2 twinkling eyes closed like the others. Argus, with all his 100 eyes, was fast asleep. To make him sleep more heavily, Mercury just touched him lightly with the dream-giving caduceus, and then he triumphantly left Io away. Juno was very angry when she found that her wonderful watchman had slept at his post, slept with all his eyes at once. She said he did not deserve to have so many eyes if he could not keep some of them open. So she took away all of his 100 eyes away from him and set them in the tail of her pet peacock, who was very proud to wear them. Ever since that day, peacocks have had eyes in their tails. Echo. Echo was a nymph who talked too much. She was very fond of having the last word. One day she spoke rudely to the great Juno, who said that for this offense Echo should never use her voice again, unless to repeat what she had just heard. But since she was so very fond of last words, she might repeat the last words of others. This was almost as bad as if Juno had changed her into a parrot. Echo was very much ashamed and hid herself in the forest. Narcissus, a young man who had hair as yellow as gold and eyes as blue as the sky, a very rare thing in Greece, where most people were very dark, used to hunt in the forest where Echo was hiding. As she was peeping out shyly from some cave or from behind a great tree, Echo often saw Narcissus, and she admired him very much. One day, Narcissus became separated from his friends, and hearing something rustle among the leaves, he called out, "Who's here?" "Here," answered Echo. "Here I am, come," said Narcissus. "I am come," said Echo. And as she spoke, she came out from among the trees. When Narcissus saw a stranger, instead of one of his friends as he had expected, he looked surprised and walked quickly away. After this, Echo never came out and allowed herself to be seen again, and in time she faded away till she became only a voice. This voice was heard for many, many years in forests and among mountains, particularly in caves. In their solitary walks, hunters often heard it. Sometimes it mocked the barking of their dogs. Sometimes it repeated their own last words. It always had a weird and mournful sound, and seemed to make lonely places more lonely still. Narcissus. Narcissus had a twin sister whom he loved better than anyone else in the world. The sister died when she was very young and very beautiful. Narcissus missed her so much that he wished he might die too. One day, as he sat on the ground by a spring, looking absently into the water and thinking of his lost sister, he saw a face like hers looking up at him. It seemed as if his sister had become a water nymph and were actually there in the spring, but she would not speak to him. Of course, the face Narcissus saw was really the reflection of his own face in the water, but he did not know that. In those days, there were no clear mirrors like ours, and the idea of one's appearance that could be got from a polished brass shield, for instance, was a very dim one. So Narcissus leaned over the water and looked at the beautiful face so like his sister's, and wondered what it was and whether he would ever see his sister again. After this, he came back to the spring day after day and looked at the face he saw there and mourned for his sister, until at last the gods felt sorry for him and changed him into a flower. This flower was the first Narcissus. All the flowers of this family, when they grow by the side of a pond or a stream, still bend their beautiful heads and look at the reflection of their own faces in the water.